you don't get people to stand up on their own 2 feet and to adopt responsibility if everything is given to them. Syndrome as you become successful, because you're in a situation where if your children ask you for something, there's no formal reason for you to say no, because you can provide whatever is being requested. But by doing that, you steal from them the opportunity to generate that for themselves. And that's, I suppose, one of the dangers of, one of the dangers of prosperity. What that does to people over the long run, I don't think we understand well yet, because most people haven't been prosperous for very long, right? There's been plenty of privation to go around, and of course there still is in many, many parts of the world, including in the United States and in the West. I think there's a push in that direction. There certainly seems to be a technical push in that direction in the universities.
Why?
Well, it's complicated, generally when I try to assess something like that, there's a rule if you're a social scientist, and the first rule is, in some sense, to look at context before you look at personality. And I think there's been a lot of really radical changes in our society in the last 50 years, and we don't understand their consequences. The most radical change is probably the birth control pill, because it's provided women with voluntary control over the reproductive function. And that's equivalent to a major biological mutation, right? Its consequence is virtually incomprehensible. I mean, partly one of the consequences is where reliable birth control is provided to women, first of all, they immediately become educated. Second, their economies tend to grow. And third, the birth rate falls below replacement. And then all three of those factors are monumental, so perhaps especially the third, the falling of the birth rate below replacement, which is the case in virtually every country in the Western world except the United States. Softness. Well, look, we don't know exactly what the optimal conditions are under which you toughen up, let's say. Most children now have older parents, right? Because people aren't having children until they're in their 30s. And there's a big difference between having a parent who's in his or her 30s and having a parent who's in his or her 20s.
Yep.
The 20-year-olds are still kind of like kids, and they're going to be more usefully neglectful, I would say. Well, look, one of the things we used to do with my daughter when she was very little was, she was about 1.5 years, is we'd have her in a room alone, and she would usually complain about that for a few minutes, and then she'd find a way to amuse herself. She liked to take books out of shelves and put them back in, and if you let her get through that initial bit of misery, then she would learn how to regulate herself, and she got very good at that. So that's a good example of minor privation having a positive influence. But children used to have multiple siblings, and siblings toughen you up because there's tremendous competition in families among siblings, and they had younger parents who had fewer resources. And now parents are older, first of all, and second, they're more resource rich, and so they're more likely to schedule their children to death in some sense to provide them with all the opportunities that they feel would be useful, and that's understandable. And plus, because they have fewer children, each child is in some sense more precious. Not like if you have 10 children, you don't love all of them, but there's 10 of them. There's only so much excess attention that can go around, and they do a lot of socializing each other rather than being socialized by parents. But if you only have one child, you're going to devote all your resources to providing them with absolutely everything you can provide them with, and one of the dangers of that is that you'll overprotect them and you'll provide them with too much. And we don't understand those dynamics, right? We don't understand how much you should stay hands off your kids and let them go out there and make their own mistakes and find their own way. And that's tricky, and we're ignorant about it. And so I think one of the consequences of that is that we do have a reasonable percentage of young people, maybe young adolescents, the kind that you hear about at university, who have been overprotected and overscheduled and under-challenged in some sense. We extend that overprotection far longer than is helpful. You know, it's hard though, because as I said, when you have resources, you can use them to make your children's lives, let's say, easier. But the question is, like, do you really want to make the life of someone you love easier? And that's an incredibly difficult question. We didn't start late compared to most of the people we knew. I think our first child was born when my wife was 29. We certainly felt that we would have had more children if we would have started earlier. There's no doubt that, and this is a very important thing to know, you know, there's not that many things in your life that are of central importance. There's half a dozen, I would say. There's your friends, there's your family, your intimate partner. By family, I mean your siblings and your parents, but then there's your children, there's your career, there's your educational trajectory, there's how you take care of yourself and protect yourself from temptation, and what sort of useful things you do in the time that you're not working. But you know, children are a third of life, something like that, maybe more. And so I would certainly recommend that you don't miss it. It's complicated because, of course, now in most situations both parents have to work, and but it's always been complicated to raise children. They're a long-term investment, but yeah, right, which is hard. That's why it's hard to even pay childcare workers, right? Because the payoff for having a child doesn't occur until 2 decades later, or sometimes 4 decades later. But it's not something you want to miss, that's for sure, because it's well, that's life, you know. It's part of the human condition, and little children pay you back immensely if you have a good relationship with them, you know, if you're on their side and encourage them, because they're an unconditional source of joy and love. The other thing I noticed that you should all know is that as you get older, your family, the family you've produced, becomes more and more important. You know, so we teach young women in particular that the fundamental goal of their life is going to be their career. And, you know, first of all, most people don't have careers, they have jobs. And those are very different things. But you're not a very happy camper, so to speak, if you're 45 and you have no one, and it doesn't go upwards after that. So don't miss it.
What are your thoughts on boarding school?
Well, I don't think that there's any evidence that there's not a lot of evidence that school quality per se is a determining factor in the outcome of educational processes. That actually seems to be a situation. I mean, there are exceptions, and I'm certainly not trying to say that every school is equal, but a tremendous amount of what determines whether or not a child is successful at school is their intelligence. I mean, you people all went to high school, to junior high school. I mean, you know that in a group of 30 kids, there's some kids that are so bright that they figure everything out in the first 15 seconds, and there are other kids who just can't get it no matter how hard they try. And that's one of the really catastrophic and built-in inequalities in the world. Generally in boarding schools, because wealth and intelligence tend to be correlated, which is also something you'd expect, right? You'd expect more intelligent people to be able to make more money. or you'd certainly at least expect less intelligent people to be able to make less money. The schools generally produce good outcomes, but it's not obvious that it's because of the schools. And this is true at higher levels of education too, to a degree that people don't really realize. So, for example, at a university like Harvard, any of the Ivy Leagues, it's very, very difficult to get in. Right, so there's far more applicants than there are positions, and they use the SAT as one of the entry criteria. So you have to have a very high SAT score, and then generally you have to be good at least one or two other things to be considered. And a very large percentage, for example, of Harvard undergraduates, and there's only about 4,000 of them, so it's a rather small school, were valedictorians of their class. And they have very high SAT scores, and the SAT is a proxy for IQ. The people who administer the SAT don't like to admit that, but there's absolutely no doubt that it's the case, because any set of questions that assess general knowledge and problem-solving ability you can derive an IQ score from. And so part of the advantage of hiring an Ivy League graduate isn't the fact that they went to a high-quality school, it's the fact that it was impossible to get in. And so the screening has been done for the employer, by the admissions process at the school. And the same thing is true of business schools, and the people who run business schools know that, is that the primary value that they offer, and again, this is not the case with every business school, is the fact that if you hire an MBA from their program, and it's a very selective program, then you have a very high probability of hiring someone who's intrinsically intelligent and conscientious, and that's a great predictor. Those are great predictors of long-term success. So, and what would you expect in a society that's essentially meritocratic? It's pretty straightforward to think this through. Not only should people who are faster and smarter be more productive, especially if they're hardworking, but that's really what you'd want, isn't it? I mean, how the hell do you want to set up your society? You want to set up your society so that incompetent people who do nothing succeed? That first of all, that can't happen. So, you know, and I should say that I'm very aware of the unfairness of a meritocratic society, of its intrinsic unfairness. So let me give you an example. I had someone write me the other day. He had listened to some of my lectures on IQ, and he sent me his IQ scores. And he was in the 5th percentile, which basically meant that 95% of the people around him were faster cognitively than he was. And you know, the letter it wasn't very grammatically correct, and it wasn't very well written, although it was very sad. And he said that he had a very difficult time finding a job and keeping one, that he was constantly frustrated and unnerved. And that's a terrible thing, you know, because it's not as if it's his fault. A lot of what constitutes your innate cognitive ability, or your cognitive ability, is something that's really granted to you by fortune and fate. And I mean, you can make someone stupider, but it's very difficult to make someone smarter, although hard work definitely is a plus. People stack up at the bottom, and it's not easy to figure out how to deal with that, but because you need the people who are leading the cognitive revolutions to develop entrepreneurial enterprises and to run things properly and to invent the new things that we all use, and hopefully to raise the living standards of society in general.